Yeah, it's still adding to that first caveat. And one thing I forgot to mention as well is that for people that cling on to the official story and may get upset, you have to remember the World War II story. There's a lot of missing elements that you get from that you don't really ever get sitting down in history class. You have to dig for these. One of those massive examples is Operation Paperclip, um, and that is an agreement where the American government and the Soviet government received into their um, intelligence facilities or throughout their government high level Nazis. One of those Nazis being Werner von Braun, who was a high level Nazi right there, shoulder to shoulder with Hitler, and he went on to essentially create NASA. And so when you look at that aspect of it, you're like, damn, I never learned about this. Why did our American government accept these high level Nazis? Shouldn't they have been treated for war crimes allegedly? And that's one aspect of it. And then you start to realize other high level American officials essentially in bed with the Nazi regime. The Dulles brothers is one example of that. Henry Ford would make vehicles for the Nazi regime. And uh, yeah, there's it just goes on and on. You've got them working with IBM. IBM was one, and then what is it? IG Farben, and there's just so many of these little instances where you see cooperation between American elites or businesses hand in hand with Nazi regime, and someone that uses critical thinking, you then have to ask the question why. I thought these guys were the worst. They're they're the worst enemy. Why are they working hand in hand with these guys? And that's when a topic like this starts to make a little bit more sense. So, just a couple more caveats I wanted to add to that.
I'm really glad you added that because what I wanted to talk about today is a little bit deeper level than all that. It's kind of like most people are familiar with Operation Paperclip, and most people are familiar with how Wall Street helped finance Hitler to power, right? This is two subjects which have been talked about a lot in the past. So for me, that's kind of like the ABCs of this. This is like really basic information. You should know that for starters. And then from there, you can build upon what I'm about to say. So this is a little bit more advanced class beyond the ABC levels. Yeah. But yeah, thank you for doing that because it helps me to remember, some of the simple things like, yes, I kind of take it for granted. Yes, everybody should know that there was Wall Street financing Hitler power, and everybody should know. Um, Probably you should also know about how Hitler escaped to Argentina after the war.
Yeah, so that's when it starts to get a little bit more advanced. I'm just trying to put myself in the mindset of someone that is just going to be hearing this information for the first time. Like, whoa, you just touched on Hitler moving to Argentina. The mainstream narrative is that Hitler committed suicide in the bunker, and I have argued this for many years now. I had the late great Gerard Williams on my show. He was on the show on the History Channel show Finding Hitler, and what you learn through that show, even though it's a mainstream show, is that the evidence for Hitler committing suicide in the bunker is very dismal. They allegedly recovered a skull. They did DNA forensics on it. It turned out to be a woman's skull. And then the Russians delayed any findings for many, many, many years. So the claim of Hitler committing suicide in the bunker, you'll hear people saying that it's conclusive, 100% conclusive, blah blah blah. That's not the case, and I will debate people on that very point. And so that leaves the option open for him escaping to South America. And some people may just be hearing this now, but there is a large German population in Argentina that's been there for decades. And you have to ask yourself why. And if there is, again, why were they allowed to escape? These guys were the big bad wolf. Why didn't the Argentinian authorities turn them in or, turn them over? And so, again, it lends credence to these high level people working hand by hand and cooperating, if you will, for some people may say the Zio Theater. And which brings me to perhaps my final caveat as I turn it all over to you, Dr. Raza. I've said this before, but if you're a new listener, there's a massive difference between uh, some people hating, quote unquote, or uh, stereotyping, if you will, an entire group of peoples. And there's a huge difference between political ideologies. And Zionism is a political ideology. I would argue an extremely dangerous one with a long, nefarious history. And you don't have to even be Jewish to be a Zionist. There are many, many Christian Zionists, people that support this movement, this quote unquote right to exist and pillage other lands and massacre the people while doing so. That's a political ideology, Zionism. And it's a massive difference from an actual person that, quote unquote, is of Jewish heritage, if you will. There are many people of Jewish heritage that do not agree with the political ideology of Zionism. So I want to make that caveat extremely clear in case there's any doubt before we move forward. But that's it. Take it away, my man.
Yeah, in fact, maybe I should repeat one of my own caveats because we did a show about this in the past about the Hitler and the Holocaust in particular, and I told you that in fact I am what could be considered to be a quarter Jew. So that means this definition of full Jew, half Jew, quarter Jew, so on and so forth, was created in the Code of Nuremberg, from Hitler. He was the one, the Zionist told him to create this Nuremberg Code. So basically, Hitler had four jobs. One, you know, round them up, sort them out, send them down to Palestine. And if you do those three things for us, we'll send you off to Argentina after the war. That was the deal, okay? From the beginning. Yeah. From 1920. That was the deal. That's what when the Thule Society hired Hitler to be his poster boy, that was the deal. Okay, we need you to be our poster boy for a messianic movement. And your actions here by rounding up the Jews and sending them to Palestine is going to help usher in the messianic age. This was the theology which they convinced Hitler to do their biddings with. Okay, so his job was just to round them up and send them to Palestine. And in exchange for that, we'll send you off to Argentina after the war. That's why he got married the night before his supposed suicide, right? His
Yeah.
he got married the night he married some young secretary, and then they supposedly killed themselves the next morning or whatever, but instead they had just gone on a submarine over to Argentina, right? So that
Yeah.
was the deal from the beginning. Back in the early 1920s, when Hitler was meeting the Thule Society and making this deal, you'll be our poster boy. That was the deal. They said, you just help us round up the Jews, sort them out. You have to give good speeches where you're talking about, oh, we're going to get the Rothschilds, but you're not going to get the Rothschilds. He was working for the Rothschild. He just pretended to capture them, you know. So this is kind of where my history class begins today, is from this so-called capture of the Rothschilds, you know, because that, in order to sell their puppet to the public, the puppet actually had to walk the walk, not only talk the talk, right? You understand? If the Rothschilds create a Hitler puppet and they're going to sell him to the German people, so the German people will be willing to fight a war for him, he's going to have to do more than just talk the talk. He's actually going to have to walk the walk, right? And then the German people will follow him. So that was walking the walk. Hitler had spoken so many years for, we've got to capture the Rothschild, so he actually had to do it, right? So he went in the what year was that? It was the 1938, right? In the year 1938, the Nazis took Austria, and that's where the Rothschild mansion was, you know. So the triumphant Hitler knocks down the door of Rothschild. It's a TV show, you know.
To be or not to be, oh baby, can't you see? We're gonna take it to the top. You're making history, and it feels so good to me. Ooh, darling, please don't ever stop.
Don't be stupid, be a smarty. Come on, join the Nazi party.
But anyway, you know, the people bought it. You know, the German people bought it. They thought, yeah, our Hitler is serious. He's after the Rothschilds, you know, but he was a puppet all along. But anyway, in the March of 1938, they captured the Rothschild mansion. Rothschild wasn't there at the time. He wasn't home when they arrived. But anyway, the name of the Rothschild is Louis Nathaniel Rothschild. He was the one living in Austria at the time but he had left his home, but the Nazis captured him at an airport as he was trying to escape. Okay, so then he went to prison, and at first they put him in kind of a small prison, and then they moved him to a hotel. You know, couldn't leave the hotel for 4 months, you know, and then he was just sent back to England on his merry way, you know. So it's still even hard for me to think how the German people could have fallen for this. It's like, I can see at the beginning, it's like, yeah, Hitler went in and he broke down the door of Rothschild and grabbed him and took him into a prison. But wait a minute, he only stayed in the prison for 4 months, and then he sent him back to England. And Hitler himself accepted a $21 million ransom from the Rothschild family. He accepted Hitler accepted $21 million as a ransom for sending this Rothschild back to England, you know. So I still, it's hard for me to imagine how the German people, even then in 1938, couldn't figure out that he was just a puppet all along.
Well, I think
You know?
one of the reasons for it is the conclusion that I reached, especially after reading Mein Kampf a couple of times over, because that was a question that I had prior to reading Mein Kampf. I'm like, how the hell did pretty much an entire country get behind this character that we are told was the worst of all time? And the conclusion I reached after reading it a couple of times is how he really appealed to extremes on both sides of the ideological spectrum. Hitler was somewhat of an oddity in that he appealed to the hardcore leftists. He also appealed to the hardcore right wingers. He pushed eugenics. He pushed universal basic income. He was a member of the National Socialists. And when you look at his more conservative, traditional views, he was German only, you know, pushing the nationalist side of things, anti-immigration and whatnot. So he didn't appeal just to one one small segment he appealed. He had ideas, quote unquote, that branched out to for everyone. So does that mean everyone agreed with everything he proposed? Probably not, but there was things that they did agree, and that's what made him so attractive to people from all over the ideological horseshoe, if you will.
Yeah, to put it in very simple terms, actually, he had found a blend between the Celtic Germanic religions and Christianity. So in that way, he could appeal to both the Christians and the people who are into this Norse Germanic religions as well. Both were acceptable to him. So that's how he became so popular, actually, like for the German people, right? And we'll come to that later. But I wanted to finish this thing. In order to sell their puppet to the people, the second thing he did was he had to uh, capture two more Rothschilds. If he would have just captured one Rothschild, they would have known that it was a hoax. So he had to capture two more Rothschilds. The other two Rothschilds, their names were Ellie de Rothschild and the Nelly Beer. So these two Rothschilds were in France, and after they were captured, they were held in a Nazi POW camp for 3 years. So that was a little bit more believable. Like, okay, the one Rothschild that you captured, you let him go on a ransom, but the other two Rothschilds, you kept them in a POW camp for 3 years. So that's a little bit more like, okay, maybe he's serious about this thing. But he was their so-called POW camp. That one Rothschild was allowed to marry his childhood sweetheart while he was in prison. They had a special marriage in prison for this Rothschild while Hitler had him in prison. So yeah, okay. And then the third thing that Hitler did was he captured the Oppenheim Bank. Okay. So you need to know why this is a very important. The Oppenheim Bank was famous because Abraham Oppenheim created a relationship with King Wilhelm I in the year 1868. So that was a Jewish banker who became friends with the king and became the banker for the king. And that story became the theme of a major Nazi propaganda campaign where there was one Jew who actually made friendship with one of our German kings. So that was the Oppenheims. So naturally, Hitler had to go capture the Oppenheim Bank, or else nobody would have thought he was serious about this thing. So so what happened with the Oppenheim Bank was this. In 1936, Otto Kaufmann who was the head of the Oppenheim Bank in that year, in 1936. The Nazi Party made him accept a German business partner to be his, running the bank together. So that was what they called this was Aryanization. It means Jewish companies can continue running as long as they become Aryanized, which means you have to accept German partners into your partnership. So that's what they first did with this Oppenheim Bank was they put a German business partner in there. And then in 1938, the bank was forced to fund the Nazi Party newspaper while Hitler was still on his rise to party. The Nazi Party forced the Oppenheims to give money to the party. In 1942, the Oppenheim horse farm was transferred to the SS. The SS had come in and captured the horse farm, and all the SS soldiers were riding around on these horses, which they had captured from the Oppenheims. And in 1944, Hitler shut down the bank and put Waldemar and Frederick Karl von Oppenheim into prison. Okay, so finally in 1944, Hitler finally put two Oppenheims into prison. You know, and but then that didn't last very long. They were released quite quickly. And in 1945, after the war was over, the bank was opened again, but they had to open the Oppenheim Bank under the name of the business partner. So for 2 years, 1945 to 1947, the Oppenheim Bank was running under this German business partner's name. But then in 1947, they just changed the name back to Oppenheim Bank, which is still sitting there today. You know, so this whole thing about Hitler was going to shut down the bank was just like a puppet show. He had no intention of shutting down the bank. He just did that for them temporarily so that the German people would believe that he was serious about shutting down these Jewish banks, you know. So this is how they sold their puppet, you know, to the German public. So now I wanted to jump into the real history of how this Hitler came to power, okay? So what happened was in the year 1918 was the foundation of the Thule Society. I don't know if you pronounce that Thule or Thule or whatever. Anyway, it's like a German occult society, right? You've heard about this Thule Society?
Yes, I have. Yeah, the like an occult type of deal, right?
Right, they were heavily into the cult. So most of the official history of World War II will say that, well, Hitler was never actually a member of the Thule Society. The official story, they say that, you know, Rosenberg was, and so on and so forth was, but Hitler was never actually a member himself, which is totally like a nonsense because Hitler was elected their poster boy. So it wouldn't matter whether his name was on the actual like membership list or not. He was the head of the party, you know. So what happened was in 1919, Hitler attends the first Thule Society lecture given by Gottfried Feder. Okay, so that was so in 1918 was the foundation of the Thule Society, and in 1919, when they were giving their public lectures, Hitler first attended his first Thule Society lecture in 1919, just a year after they were founded. And by the winter of 1919, Hitler was allowed to become one of the guest lecturers in one of these Thule Society meetings, right? So he had attended his first Thule Society lecture, was so impressed, started becoming friends with them, started working his way up the ladder, and says, I can deliver speeches for you too. And finally, by that winter in 1919, they allowed Hitler to deliver a Thule Society lecture because he was already so good at speaking. After that lecture, the Thule Society was so impressed that they adopted him as, I can say, what's the word, like an apprentice. Yeah, they adopted it as an apprentice. So he had a teacher, or you can call it a guru, an occult guru. The name of his occult guru was Dietrich Eckart. Okay. So when Hitler gave in 1919, when Hitler gave his speech to the Thule Society, Dietrich Eckart was the one who approached Hitler after the speech and said, "You did a good job. Now we're going to accept you as our apprentice." So he met with Rosenberg. Okay, Rosenberg was the guy with all the money. Okay, but before Hitler could meet Rosenberg, yeah, there's Eckhart. So Eckhart was Hitler's occult guru. Okay, so it means he trained him in all the theosophy and the philosophy behind theosophy, and and all this occult Blavatsky and all this stuff, all this occult stuff. That was his guru, his teacher, was teaching him all this stuff. So Hitler first had to train with that teacher before he could get introduced to Rosenberg, because Rosenberg was the head of the Thule Society. He was the guy with all the money. So Hitler had to go for an audition in front of Rosenberg. And so he had to practice many years for this audition. So I think this audition was sometime either in 1920 or 1921, where Eckhart took Hitler in to meet Rosenberg. Once Rosenberg put his stamp on Hitler, he became the poster boy for the party. You're gonna be the one and the official title they called him was the Messiah for the German people. You're gonna lead Germany into a new Germany. You're gonna help liberate Germany. But the reason why Hitler agreed to do it was, you're going to round up the Jews and send them to Palestine. And in doing so, you're going to help us fulfill messianic prophecy. Okay? It was a Zionistic agenda from the beginning, this whole Thule society. They had all this Germanic lineage and stuff like that. And they were able to blend the ancient Germanic religions with modern day Christianity. They had presented the occult and Christianity together in a way that both the occultists and the Christians could accept it. But the whole thing was just, the whole agenda was just to get the round up the Jews and send them to Palestine. That was the whole thing from the beginning. That's why they hired Hitler as their poster boy. Is we just want you to, deliver the speeches for us and round up the Jews and fight this World War II for us and create this so-called Holocaust for us. So let's see. So what happened? So Hitler met Rosenberg in 1920, and that's when they agreed to make him the poster boy for the Thule Society. So in the next step for him to do was to go out and get arrested. Okay, this is actually, so you heard about the beer hall push, right? Where Hitler was arrested.
Yeah. That's
Okay.
pretty much we're told while he was arrested is when he started brewing his whole Mein Kampf.
He wrote the Mein Kampf while he was in prison. So a group of his buddies started a protest, and they were all arrested. And so it was called making your Messiah into
A martyr or
a martyr, right? You got
Yeah.
it. Making your Messiah into a martyr. So Hitler had to spend a certain amount of time in prison after this beer hall push. And so that is keeping in order with messianic prophecy, okay? When you have a Messiah, that Messiah has to spend a certain amount of time in prison, because the Shabbatai Tzvi, the first Jewish Messiah, was in prison in the year 1666. And then the second Messiah, Jacob Frank, had also been put in prison for a certain amount of time. So Hitler, keeping in step with these other messiahs, had to spend a certain amount of time in prison. And while he was in prison, him and his Thule Society buddies who were sitting in the prison cell with him wrote Mein Kampf together. Okay, so let's come back here. So that was called the beer hall push, right? That's when Hitler was arrested, Hitler and his buddies. So let's see. He spent just over 1 year in prison after being arrested. Him and his buddies spent 1 year in prison, and during that time he had the time to write the Mein Kampf, right? So the whole thing about being put in prison was just like a puppet show to make your hero seem like a martyr. Oh, see, look, he was so sincere. He spent time in prison, So anyway, next one. While Hitler was sitting in prison, he had a Jewish lawyer by the name of Hans Frank. Okay, so Hans Frank was a Jewish lawyer for the Thule Society, and when the beer beer hall push happened and they arrested the party members, Hans Frank had escaped the country and escaped prosecution, and he was hiding in Munich. And then somehow he was able to clear his legal name so that he was not associated with it, and then he was able to come back to Germany. So Hitler's Jewish lawyer was able to disassociate himself from the movement in order to come back and start his practice again in Germany. All right. Uh, then next thing was in 1925. This is the quote from Mein Kampf. Okay, so while Hitler was in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, and the there's only one important line in that whole book. Okay, I personally haven't read that book, but it's like I know that there's only one important line in that whole book. That's the whole reason why he wrote that book, is because of this one line. So I'm gonna read you this one line right now. He said, "Is not their very existence founded upon a great lie, namely, that they are a religious community, whereas in reality they are a race?" This is the quote that the Zionists needed Hitler to say. He needed Hitler to say that Judaism is a race and not a religion. Okay? This is what the Zionists needed him to say. And still to this day, anybody who opposes Zionism is a racist, because this is the lie of Zionism. The lie of Zionism is that the Judaism is a race and not a religion, and you are racially bound to support the state of Israel. If you have this so-called Jewish DNA, you're racially bound to support the state of Israel, and anybody who's against the state of Israel is a racist. And that all began from Mein Kampf. Hitler was the first one to say it. He said that Judaism is a race, not a religion. That was exactly what the Zionists needed him to say. That's why he wrote Mein Kampf. It's just for that one line to say that the Jews are a race and not a religion. That's the foundation of Zionism, you can say. They needed Hitler to say that. So that Mein Kampf was written while Hitler was in prison in 1925. And when Hitler was released from prison, he took a series of 9 photographs with Heinrich Hoffmann. And Heinrich Hoffmann was a very famous German photographer. And he took these photos of Hitler giving his speeches. Oh, we're so powerful. And these 9 photographs went into all the German newspapers everywhere. And these 9 photos of Hitler giving speeches was what started selling Hitler to the Germans. They started selling the puppet. He's free from prison now. You see how serious he was. He spent 1 year in prison already for us. He's a real leader of our cause. So they started promoting their puppet with these 9 photos after he was released from prison. Okay, it's very interesting. You can go look up those photos. All right. Next, Eric Jan Hannesson was a Jewish psychic who predicted Hitler's rise to power. So there was a Jewish psychic, so this was right after Hitler got out of prison and Hitler started making his photos public. And then this Jewish psychic came along and said, I saw a vision from God that Hitler was going to rise to power. You found his photo?
Yeah, Eric Jean Hannesson.
Yeah, a Jewish psychic. So the Jewish already started putting money into this guy. and many Germans who were into the occult were already very familiar with this guy. So all of the German occultists who had been following this Jewish psychic, all of a sudden, wow, this Jewish psychic is promoting Hitler. So that's how the German occultist realized that he was the guy for them. You know, they actually used a Jewish psychic to sell it, to the Germans. Okay, next one is this Jewish psychic also he was very wealthy, so he started loaning money to the Nazi party officials because a lot of these Nazi party officials were having these gambling problems. When the Nazi party was kind of young, they had these big parties and they had drinking and gambling going on, and anytime that these Nazi officials lost too much money on gambling, they could borrow money from this Jewish psychic. Oh, nobody's heard of this stuff before, but anyway, the relations between the Zionists and the Nazis is so deep. So anyway, let's keep going. Okay, next one. In January 27, 1933, okay, January 27, 1933, there was something called the Nazi Party Ground. It was a huge property which the Nazi Party had bought, where there was like a big stage and a huge lawn, and they could fill the lawn up with thousands of soldiers. And this was the Nazi rally, which happened every year. So on every year, the Nazi Party had this annual rally at this big like palace they had bought. So the first of these rallies, the first of the Nazi rallies, was in January 27, 1933. And at that time, Joseph Goebbels announced that the Jewish boycott of German goods was causing economic harm to Germany. This is a very important point. This is a very important point. You've heard about this, the Jewish boycott of German goods. So this was also a controlled opposition movement. Yeah, Goebbels. So he was the chief of propaganda. He was the one who would give the speeches whenever Hitler wasn't giving the speeches. So he was announcing that these darn Jews over there in England and USA are boycotting German goods, and that's causing economic depression here in Germany. And that was the lie that launched the first rally of the Nazi Party, January 27. Okay, the reason why the Nazi Party chose January 27 is because that is the date that Emperor Trajan of Rome took the throne. Okay, so Emperor Trajan was known as one of the 5 good emperors. Okay, now Emperor Trajan takes the throne in the year 98 AD, but he happened to take the throne supposedly on January 27. Okay, so the Nazi Party chose the anniversary of Emperor Trajan taking the throne because for some reason Emperor Trajan to the German people represented this ancient Germanic heritage and Germanic religion, which they had found a combination between this ancient Germanic religion and the modern day Christianity. Okay, that's how they sold it to the people. So they were using this January 27, 1933 as the holiday because Emperor Trajan supposedly came to the throne on that day. That's the myth that they had sold to the German people, why we're creating this special day for our Nazi party, So let me just, to remind you, that's January 27 on the year 1933 at the Nazi Party rally grounds. Joseph Goebbels announced that that the Jews of America and England are harming us as Germans economically by boycotting us. And that really drove many of the German people into uprage. Yeah. Finally, just 3 days later was the day that Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. He had won his way. So on January 30, 1933, Hitler was elected as Chancellor of Germany. And the same day that Hitler was elected Chancellor, then the Jews of America and London announced officially announced their boycott of German goods. So again, this is just a puppet show going on. The the Jews of America and Germany had no intention of actually boycotting Germany. They just had to do that in order to pretend that they were opposed to the Nazis. But actually, they were supporting the Nazis all along. They knew that the Nazis were going to be the ones to help them create the state of Israel later, right? So this whole Jewish boycott of Nazi Germany is just a puppet show. They knew that Hitler was working for them all along, So don't be confused about this. So next thing that happened was, so Hitler came to power in January 30, and in June, Hitler entered into talks with the Zionists, and those talks led to the Havara Agreement, the Havara Transfer Agreement, right? So this was what the whole World War II was about. It was about the Havara Transfer Agreement, means rounding up the Jews and sending them to Palestine. That's what Hitler was brought to power to do, and that's exactly what he did right after he came to power, right? So again, in January of 33, Hitler became chancellor. In June of 33, Hitler started entering into talks with the Zionists. And then in August of 33, he finally signed the agreement, the Havara Transfer Agreement. And that's what the whole thing was about. How to get the Jews out of Germany, out of Poland, out of Ukraine, and down into Palestine. That's what the whole World War II was about. That's what they brought Hitler to power for, and that's exactly what he did. And that's why they sent him to Argentina after the war, because he lived up exactly to his promise. Okay. So the Havara Agreement happened on August 25th, right? And they chose that day, August 25th, because that's a very important Freemasonic Zionistic holiday for them. All right. That was the day that the first Dutch Republic started declaring their independence, right? We did a whole nother show about the history of the bankers and how it all began in the Netherlands, right? So it was these Dutch that started the first bank, and they're using that same holiday, August 25th, the launching of this Dutch Republic, for this Havara Agreement signed. In the year 1248, the Dutch city of Oman became the first city to gain the free state status called the Hansa. So the next thing, August 2nd, 1934, that was the day Hitler became the Führer of Germany, right? So that was a huge day for the Freemasons when Hitler finally, and the Zionists, when Hitler finally became Freemason. So let's look at that date, okay? August 2nd was the day that Hitler became Führer. What else happened on August 2nd? That is the day that the Jews were supposedly expelled from Spain during the Spanish Inquisition. Okay. The Spanish, the Spanish Inquisition was 1492, right? That's the day that the supposedly Jews were expelled from Spain, right? And they had also used the date August the 2nd, same day that Hitler became Führer of Germany. Now, this is more than a coincidence because actually, if you think of it from the bigger picture, World War II is actually just a copy paste of the Spanish Inquisition. Okay, you with me, Weezy? You know, the Spanish Inquisition, you had this auto de fe, right? And who was that puppet? Torquemada, right?
The Inquisition. Let's begin. The Inquisition. Look out, Sam. We have a mission to convert the Jews.
Torquemada was the puppet that the Jewish bankers used to supposedly attack the Jews. Jews attacking Jews, right? That's what the Spanish Inquisition was, and that's what World War II was. You hire the Jews, you have the Zionists attacking anti-Zionists. It's very important, okay? So the World War II was actually no difference from the Spanish Inquisition almost. It was just a psyop, you know, where you hire a puppet to go attack your own people, okay? The only difference was this. During the Spanish Inquisition, the Ashkenazi Jews were attacking the Sephardic Jews, whereas during World War II, it was Ashkenazi Jews attacking Ashkenazi Jews. You know, in both situations, they were Zionists attacking anti-Zionists. Just the difference was during the Spanish Inquisition, the anti-Zionists happened to be the Sephardic Jews, while as during World War II, the anti-Zionists were also Ashkenazi Jews. That's why they invaded Poland and Ukraine, is because that's where all the anti-Zionist Jews were living. You know, they had to round them up and send them to Palestine. So there was, you know, so it's not a coincidence that Hitler becoming this Führer of Germany was the same day that this Torquemada launched the Spanish Inquisition. You know. All right. So next thing that happened after Hitler became the Führer of Germany, the first thing that happened was the illegal immigration of Jewish settlers to Palestine. Okay, German ships were sending Jewish people down to Palestine. So this
What are
is
we looking at?
This is an extremely rare image. I don't know how I found this and how you're ever going to find it again. But I mean, you can try searching, but you know, good luck. It's a very rare image. This is an image of Nazi Germany, and you can see on the sign it says the Palestine Transit Camp. Okay, that means that Jewish people were in transit on their way to Palestine. Okay, that's what World War II was about. Okay, this is it. If one picture, all you need to understand World War II is this picture. That's all World War II was about, was sending Jewish people to these transit camps and then sending them on down to Palestine. So this is the actual transfer. These are Jewish people being rounded up out of their homes. Okay? Pack your bags. Put all your valuables in your bags. You're going to get sent down to Palestine. So you can see the German Nazi troops pulling them out of their homes, putting them on the trucks, and put all your goods and belongings onto the trucks. Okay, the trucks are being taken down to the railway cars. Okay, so get inside the railway cars, bring all your goods with you. Okay, so you can see the Jewish people riding in the railway cars here. And where are they going? They're going down to the ocean. So coming out of the railway cars, taking their goods with them. marching down from the railway cars to the ocean, where they're going to get on boats. And there's the boats. Okay, you see the you got the whole thing here right in front of you. That's what the whole war was about. Rounding Jewish people out of their homes, taking them down, putting them on boats, and sending them to Palestine. That's what the World War II was, in a nutshell. That's it. That's the whole agenda. That's why Hitler was brought to power, was to do exactly that, to put these Jewish people on the boat and take them down to Palestine. Here's the proof of it, you know.
Well, it's not just this clip. I mean, it's all the relationships that you
Well, there.
brought
Okay,
forth
if
at
you
the very
search,
beginning as well.
if you search the word Aliyah Bet, you can find hundreds of images of Jewish people riding boats and arriving down in Palestine.
How do you
It's
spell
kind
that?
of Aliyah, Aliyah. The second word is Bet, Aliyah Bet. These are the boats. So let me try to explain what this Aliyah Bet is. This is very important. This is what the whole war was about, okay? If you go to the Wikipedia page, Aliyah Bet, it's going to tell you that there was 142 voyages made by 120 ships, okay? So you think of that, okay? 120 ships, and some of those ships made more than one journey. So there in total was 142 journeys from Germany down to Palestine. Okay, Aliyah Bet. Okay, and you can see just the image, the first image, you see the Jews coming off the boat, you know, after they arrived in Palestine. Okay, so there was 142 of these journeys, okay, both before, during, and after the war. Okay, both before, during, and after the war, the Germans were helping send Jewish people down to Palestine. Now, I have to explain what is meant by the word bet. Okay, so this so-called Aliyah was the word Aliyah means return to Israel. This Aliyah was divided into two parts: the Aliyah Aleph and the Aliyah Bet, which means literally it means Aliyah A and Aliyah B. So Aliyah A means the legal immigration, and Aliyah B means the illegal immigration. Okay, so what it means is this: when you talk about legal immigration, okay, the legal immigration was that the the British government would only allow a certain quota of Jewish people to migrate to Palestine at the time. Okay, so what it means, the word Aliyah Bet, it means that this is an illegal immigration. All those boats, those 142 boats, those were just the illegal boats. Okay, there was also the legal boats on top of that. Okay, so there was a lot of Jews transferred to Palestine, both before, during, and after the war. So the first of these illegal ships took sail in the year 1934, okay, way before the war began. And what happened after that? So in 1935, let's take a step back, because I always like to look at the bigger timeline. So Hitler came to power, and he signed an agreement with the Zionists to start transferring Jews to Palestine. And then, he started after he became the Führer. He actually started sending boatloads full of German Jews down to Palestine. Started in 1934. And in 1935, the next thing he did was he introduced the Nuremberg Laws. Okay, so the Nuremberg Laws, this is exactly what the Zionists needed him to do, was to introduce these Nuremberg Laws, because the Nuremberg Laws are the laws which say whether or not you're a full Jew, a half Jew, a quarter Jew, or a zero. Mm. So that's called the Nuremberg laws. And so the German troops were instructed, you whenever you find a Jewish person, you ask them these questions, was your grandmother a Jew? And if your grandmother wasn't a Jew, was your father's mother a Jew? So these questions: was your mother a Jew? Was your mother's mother a Jew? Was your father's mother a Jew? These were the questions that the German soldiers would ask the Jewish people, and according to their answer, they would mark it on their Nuremberg laws chart, and that said, this Jew is a full Jew, this Jew is a half Jew, this Jew is a quarter Jew. Okay, this was obviously before you could take a DNA test, right? So they had the soldiers just asking questions. Who was your grandmother? Who was your father's grandmother? That's how they did the DNA test in those days. So the point is, this Nuremberg laws about whether you're a full Jew, half Jew, quarter Jew still exist today in the state of Israel. I cannot immigrate to Israel because I'm a quarter Jew. Okay. Today, anybody who thinks you're Jewish, you can just take a DNA test, and then you can find out whether or not you're eligible to actually immigrate to Israel or not. So it's a totally racist policy, and it has been. So so the Zionists who are running Israel today, this racist policy of who is allowed to immigrate based on their DNA, was started by Hitler in this Nuremberg laws. When Hitler first started making the chart, are you a full or half or a quarter? Okay, so that's the other thing Hitler did to help the Zionists, was he was the one who started this whole system of classification, full, half, quarter. So what happened after that? On November of 1938 was the night of broken glass. And that's when Hitler started, the German troops started breaking the shop windows of the Jewish shop owners. They call it the night of broken glass because there was a lot of Jewish shops, and they smashed the glass windows of these Jewish shops and rounded some of them up. So that's when you can say the war began, once Hitler started attacking these Jewish shops, So this night of broken glass happened in November of 1938. And in May of May 23rd, 1939, was when the House of Lords issued the White Paper. The White Paper was issued on May 23rd, 1939. So this is the important one. This began the so-called Aliyah Alap, the legal immigration. So what we mean by legal immigration was the House of Lords issued 75,000 certificates to Jewish people. They printed out 75,000 certificates that said this certificate allows you to immigrate to Palestine. So the British government, in conjunction with the Zionists, had agreed. The Zionists were putting pressure on the British to allow Jewish immigrants to move to Palestine. So there was a puppet show going on, okay? And the British were pretending that we're only going to allow a certain number of immigrants per year. And so we're going to issue out certain certificates, and those people who have the certificates are legal immigrants, and those people without the certificate are illegal immigrants. And so the British ships actually started trying to shoot down some of these German ships that were bringing these illegal immigrants. But that whole thing was also just a puppet show. The British had no intention of preventing Jewish people from immigrating to Palestine, not at all. But they had to do this puppet show to make it seem like they were holding on to these limits set by the White Paper. the white paper limits, which created a line between the legal immigration and the illegal immigration. So the whole thing was a puppet show. All right, next one is in the year 1939. In that year, three the illegal ships, okay, three illegal ships set sail from Germany headed towards Palestine. And these three ships were after war had been declared. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Germans were sending Jewish people to Palestine both before, during, and after the war. It's very important for people to know that. That's what the whole thing was about, was transferring Jews to Palestine. So in the 1939, after World War II had already been declared, there was three more of these Aliyah Bet ships, the so-called illegal immigrants, made their way on down to Palestine. Then, the year 1940, there was three more of these Aliyah Bet, the illegal ships, were transferring Jews down to Palestine in the year 1940, while in the heat of World War II, German ships were still sending Jews on down to Palestine. Don't be confused about many people who try to lie about the official story. They'll say, well, the Germans weren't transferring Jews during wartime. No, wrong. They were transferring Jews during wartime, before, during, and after the war. This illegal transfer was going on all the time, and both the legal and the illegal transfer was going on. So, in the year 1940 was Hitler visits Vimy Ridge in France. Okay, Vimy Ridge is a Freemasonic memorial. In France, there's a twin tower. Hitler, after he invaded France, he found this Freemasonic memorial, and he chose not to demolish it. For some reason, Hitler, who was supposedly anti-Freemason, chose not to destroy the most important 9/11 Twin Towers, the Vimy Ridge Freemasonic temple in all of France. Okay, there's the Twin Towers of France that Hitler chose not to destroy. So, and the reason that he gave for that is because he had fought in World War I. Yeah, so there's the Twin Towers of Vimy Ridge, and Hitler's there. And Hitler, maybe somebody asked him, like, why didn't you destroy this Freemasonic temple? And Hitler said, well, this is a World War I memorial, and I had fought in World War I. So this is the reason why he gave for not destroying this Freemason. He allowed himself to be photographed. It's not just a coincidence that he allowed himself to be photographed at a Freemasonic 9/11 Twin Tower memorial. He also went there on a special day. He went there on the June the 2nd. So again, this is an indication that Hitler was not a so-called anti-Freemasons. He wasn't. He was a puppet of the whole Zio Freemasonic network. The next thing, we're coming here to the 1940s, and this was the so-called Madagascar Plan. Okay, this is, like I said, the Zionists and the neo-Nazis always tried to make a big deal out of this Madagascar camp. Oh, look, and Hitler was planning on sending Jews to Madagascar, not to Palestine, which is a total lie. Hitler never, for once, considered actually sending. So this what happened with the Madagascar Plan is that supposedly Hitler started promoting it for a period of 1 month, but then during the Battle of Britain, the British troops had actually defeated the German troops, and so that was the excuse that Hitler used to supposedly drop the Madagascar Plan. Okay, so this is, again, it's just a puppet show. Hitler never for 1 second ever considered transferring Jews to Madagascar. The whole thing was just like to get people's minds off of the true thing which was going on, which was that all the Jews are being sent to Palestine. So that little puppet show of the so-called Madagascar plan happened for a period of 1 month there in 1940. And now let's go on to the next one. 1943. The Coher Report.
It says right here, during World War
Okay.
II, the Coher was commissioned by Heinrich Himmler to calculate the number of Jews in Europe subject to special treatment. From 1937 to December 1942, Coher completed the Coher Report in January of 1943 and handed it over to the SS Obersturmbannführer, Dr.
Okay, so
Rudolf.
let me get to the numbers here, because this is the important thing. Is this Coher Report said that over 1.4 million Jews had been processed in the greater Poland region. Over 1.4 million Jews had been processed. That was the English translation. What does it mean, processed? Okay, so this, a lot of people ask, how many Jews were there and how many Jews died. So you have this 6 million number, and some of the Holocaust historians, such as David Cole, he can't. If you ask David Cole how many Jews died during the Holocaust, David Cole is a Jewish guy. In case you don't know him, David Cole. Are you familiar with David Cole? He
Yes.
came on. He's a young Jewish guy that came on the Oprah Winfrey show, doubting the official Holocaust story, doubting the 6 million number. A young Jewish guy, and he was torn apart. He was criticized and ostracized, for coming on the Oprah show and saying he questioned the official. And he also, there's another very interesting part of his story. Okay, again, David Cole. He since he was Jewish, he went to Auschwitz. Okay, and he met Auschwitz has a museum, the Holocaust Museum at Auschwitz. Okay, so this young Jewish guy shows up with a camera, and he was talking to the curator of the museum. And the curator of the museum, David Cole was wearing his little Jewish hat and say, "I'm Jewish, I'm with you," and so then the curator of the museum allowed him to interview him. And during that interview, David Cole asked the curator of the museum, "Why do you have a building over here which says that Jews died here when it's a proven historical fact that this building was not even built until after the war? Why are you selling a false Holocaust here?" A Jewish guy came to the Auschwitz Museum and asked the curator of the museum why he's doing that. And the curator of the museum said, sorry, we're going to put up a plaque which says that this so-called gas chamber is a reproduction, that no Jews ever died in this chamber. So the Auschwitz Museum was forced to admit that their gas chamber was a fake because of this young Jewish guy who happened to come in with a camera and filmed the curator admitting on film that the gas chamber was built after the war. Nobody died in there. And so he's a very important, this young Jewish guy, David Cole. If people were to ask me, like, how many Jews died during the Holocaust, I would say, look at David Cole's estimates. David Cole, he's done a lot of research to this, especially, on this Coher Report and Operation Reinhardt. And he says that his estimation is that 3.5 million Jews died. That's his estimation. which actually
And
aligns with.
some people even argue that a huge number of those deaths were attributed to things such as typhus, which was very prevalent
Right.
at the time.
Well,
So
yeah, that comes into the other question of the whole gas chamber. So there's the gas chambers which they found were gas chambers for treating clothes of liphas. They were using this blue powder, this Persian blue, to kill the liphas on the clothes of the Jewish workers. The gas chambers were designed to save lives, not to destroy lives. Okay, they were killing typhus in these gas chambers. You know, so you know, so let me come back to my. I think I want to do a share screen. Okay, so I think that this may be the only honest or slightly honest Wikipedia page on this subject. Okay, I find that these numbers might be. I'm gonna kind of read through this really quick, just the numbers section. So it says here that okay, the Germans abducted approximately 12 million people from almost 20 European countries. Okay, so I forgot the name of the article. The name of the article is Forced Labor Under German Rule During World War II. Forced labor. It means they were forcing people to work in work camps. All right, so it says 12 million people were abducted. And the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945 freed approximately 11 million foreigners categorized as displaced persons, most of whom were the forced laborers. So here at the top it says the Germans abducted approximately 12 million people, and at the end of the war, 11 million people were freed. Okay? So the difference between these two numbers is 1 million people. They captured 12 million, and at the end of the war, they freed 11 million. Okay, but you can't just say, "Oh, that means 1 million died." No, I mean it means that during that time period, some people died, some people were born. Many children were probably born in these work camps as well. So if you go down a little bit more, it says during the war, German forces brought into the Reich 6.5 million civilians, in addition to Soviet POWs for these labor factories. And the next one is that, okay, 5.2 million foreign workers and POWs were repatriated to the Soviet Union after the war. 1.6 million to Poland, 1.5 million to France, 900,000 to Italy, 300,000 to 400,000 to Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Netherlands, Hungary, Belgium. So actually, these numbers don't even add up. If you add up the numbers of people that were returned to their homeland after the war, it's much greater than the number that were captured. So they actually returned more people than they captured. So, you have to kind of figure this out. That means there was, maybe some children were being born in these work camps or something. And, but anyway, how many people actually died? I don't know. The important thing is this. The question which everybody's asking is how many Jews died, right? Was it 6 million Jews died? David Cole estimated 3.5 million Jews died. And that actually fits in with the Holocaust webpage. They have a Holocaust webpage where you can, if you're a Jewish person, you can type in your family name and you can find if any of your relatives died. And if you go to this Jewish Holocaust encyclopedia, it says there we have the names of 4 million Jews. you can believe what you want, but the important thing is this: it's not a question of how many Jewish people died during the Holocaust. What do you mean, Jewish people? Are you talking about the full Jews, the half Jews, the quarter Jews? It's not a question of how many Jews died. What actually happened is the German troops started rounding up the Jewish people and started asking them, who was your grandfather? Who was your grandmother? Who was your mother's grandmother? Who was your father's grandmother? And according to these questions, they marked their Nuremberg laws. Is he a full Jew, a half Jew, a quarter Jew, or a what they call the gypsy? A gypsy is just anybody who's a 0% Jewish. So now the thing is that if you were a full Jew or a half Jew, you would get a tattoo on your arm. Okay? That means you were marked to be a survivor. That means the Zionists wanted you. They wanted you to be kept alive. They wanted you to be sent to Palestine. They wanted you to survive the war. If you were a full Jew or half Jew and you got the tattoo, that's why you got the tattoo. You were marked to be a survivor. If you were a quarter Jew, like me, if I would have been alive in Germany, I would have been killed because I was a quarter Jew. I wouldn't get the tattoo, And so that's what you mean when you say like how many Jews died. Well, the mainly it was just the quarter Jews and the gypsies that got killed. Those were the ones who weren't marked for survival.
No one ever talks about the gypsies, man. They get no love.
Almost to the end of my thing here, so I'm going to try to wrap this up here. In the year 1944, the country of Turkey, also helped to smuggle in these illegal Jews through this so-called Aliyah bet. The whole thing was a hoax. The British weren't trying to stop any Jewish immigrants, but they had to pretend like they were trying to stop them. And they stopped some of these illegal immigrants in Turkey, but most of them got through because the Turkish government was helping them. And from December of 1945, the end of the war, the legal immigration and the illegal immigration continued. German ships kept on sending Jews down to Palestine. And so there was the so-called legal immigration and the illegal immigration. So the legal immigration were those Jews which were holding the card. There was a certificate given by the British government which said you're allowed to migrate to Palestine. And then from the year 1945, there was hundreds of illegal ships that were sending Jews down to Palestine that didn't have these immigration cards. There was hundreds of these so-called Aliyah bet ships that happened between the year 1945 and the year 1948 when the state of Israel was created. So the Germans were sending Jews to Palestine both before, during, and after the war. And it especially picked up, of course, after the war. There was hundreds of both legal ships and illegal ships carrying Jews down to Palestine, because that's what the whole thing was about, is how to get more Jews down to Palestine. And so as a last thing for this, I wanted to say that this is not the first time in history where the Zionists used one of their puppets to create a so-called Holocaust. It's not the first time in history where the Zionists did this Holocaust. So I want to give a little bit of a history of some of these other ones. So in the year 1881, Alexander III of Russia, both Alexander III and his father, this was the Tsar of Russia, the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Alexander III, was created anti-Jewish laws. And at that time, in 1881, Theodor Herzl was sitting there in Europe, and he said, I can use this to my advantage. we've got this anti-Semitic Russian Tsar, and I can use this to my advantage because there's a lot of Jews sitting there in Russia who are not moving, who are not Zionists. They're not packing up their bags and moving to Palestine like I want. That Herzl, that was his idea. All the Jews of the world come to Palestine. But there was many Jews like, why would I want to move to Palestine? I'm happy living here in Russia. You know, so what happened was there was this Russian Tsar who started persecuting Jews in Russia, and from that time, in the year 1895, Theodor Herzl released a book called The Diaries of Theodor Herzl, and in that book, Theodor Herzl wrote, "The anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends. The anti-Semitic countries are allies."
Here's
So
that. I'm just pulling up the quote real quick, and this is even the AI normie shows it. Theodor Herzl believed that anti-Semitism could be instrumentalized to advance Zionism, famously writing in his diaries that the anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries our allies. So there you go.
yeah. So the thing is that he told us right there in 1895 that this so-called Holocaust was happening, and let's keep going with that. So in the 1903 was actually the first of these so-called Holocausts. That the name of that is called the Kishinev pogroms. Maybe you can even look that up. So let me spell that for you. It's a Kishinev. So this was when Theodor Herzl used anti-Semitism to his advantage. It was just like World War II, but this was 1903. Okay, so he got these anti-Semites to go attack the Jews, and what happened was from that time, this gave rise to Bolshevism. You can research this Kishinev program later, but it's really important to understand the connection between this and Bolshevism, because nobody's going to tell you about this. And the reason I know about it is because I've interviewed this ex-Soviet Department of Defense. I did an interview, with this ex-Soviet, and he was the one who educated me about this. So what happened during the Soviet Union was they had created a new form of Christian Zionism. Okay, most people don't know this, and I didn't know this until my ex-Soviet whistleblower friend explained this to me. So they had created a new form of Christian Zionism, and that's what the Bolsheviks used to sell to the Russian people. So the Bolsheviks themselves most of them were Jewish, as we all know, but they claimed to be atheists. So they had created a new form of Christian Zionism where these Russian Christians could accept Jewish people based on this, and the Soviet agenda was a Christian Zionist movement, and somehow these Christian Zionists could cooperate with atheists because the atheists were Jews, and the Jews were a part of this Christian Zionist. So that's actually what the Bolshevik movement was. And so the pogroms of 1903 was the excuse that the Russians used to create this Christian Zionism. They said, oh, those Christians who did the pogroms of 1903 were anti-Zionist Christians. This Kishinev pogrom of 1903, the Theodor Herzl used this to advantage. Oh, look, those evil anti-Semite, those anti-Zionist Christians attacked us. And so that gave birth to this Russian version of Christian Zionists, which still exists today in Russia. So, so what happened after that? In 1904, the Russo-Japanese War, Jacob Schiff, the American banker Jacob Schiff, who was the Rothschild agent, who funded the Russo-Japanese War. So Jacob Schiff, this Rothschild agent, started giving money to arm the Japanese army to go attack Russia. And the excuse that Jacob Schiff was using, why he needed to fund these Japanese, is because we got to go out and get those evil Russians, because those evil Russians are attacking the Jews. You know, so Jacob Schiff, being a Jewish, said, I'm contributing to charitable things by funding the Japanese, because those Japanese are going to go attack the Russians. So it's called the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Okay, and next thing that happened was in 1915, the American newspaper started using the 6 million number.
He has 10 newspapers between the years of 1915 and 1938. The first newspaper is The Sun of New York. New York, June the 6th, 1915. Since the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the Jewish people have had no darker page in their history than that which the Russian government is writing today. 6 million Jews.
So this 6 million number it's obviously a Kabbalistic number. The Jews had been plotting a Holocaust for many, many years, and they knew that this 6 million number was going to be used in this upcoming Holocaust. In 1918, from 1918 to 1920, it was called the Second Polish Republic. In Poland, they created a new government called the Second Polish Republic. And that Polish Republic was very much against the Jews. They were saying, oh, look at these Jews, they help fund the Bolsheviks, So the Second Polish Republic started rounding up the Jewish people, sending them to prison camps, and deporting them. So this again it's the same thing that happened during World War II. You round up the Jews, put them in camps, deport them to other countries. The only difference between this Polish Republic rounding up the Jews was because they just sent them to America. In fact, so from the years 1918 to 1920, during this Second Polish Republic, so many Jews were immigrating to America that by the year 1921, the U.S. passed an Emergency Quota Act to prohibit the number of Jewish immigrants entering the country. Okay, so many. So it's like my ancestry. I have my father's grandmother was Messenheimer. So that means that's why I'm a quarter Jew, because my great, on my father's side had come to America from this Polish expulsion of the Jews. They sent them all to America. And one of my great ancestors was one of these, So this Polish Holocaust, you can call it, the first Holocaust, was when they started sending Jews to America. And then, so what happened was, after that, in 1936, the New York Times published the word Holocaust.
New York Times, Sunday, May the 31st, 1936. The petition, in expressing the opinion of enlightened Christian leadership in the United States favouring a larger Jewish immigration into Palestine, stressed the intolerable sufferings of the millions of Jews in the European Holocaust.
In that newspaper, they use the word Holocaust. It's like, wait a minute, how can you use the word Holocaust if the Holocaust hasn't even happened yet? The war hasn't even started yet, and they're already using the word Holocaust, So it's crazy, And in fact, this word Holocaust, we don't know how old this word is. They might have been planning. The Holocaust might have been planning this thing for 1,000 years. These Ashkenazis lost their homeland of Khazaria 1,000 years ago, and they're like, we want to go create Israel. So this whole idea of creating Israel by the Ashkenazi is actually 1,000 years ago, when these Ashkenazi lost their homeland of Khazaria. They already started planning to return to Israel. And part of their plan was that in order for us to return to Israel, a Holocaust has to happen first. So we don't know how old this word Holocaust is. It could even be 1,000 years old. For 1,000 years, they were planning on creating a state of Israel after an event which they referred to as a Holocaust. So they've been planning this Holocaust for a long time, and they knew that the state of Israel was going to be coming up after it. That's part of their prophecy. So so this thing goes back a long time. The first so-called in the year, this is also a review, but we covered this before, but it was called the Pogrom of 1012. In the year 1012, so like more than 1,000 years ago, there was a pogrom in Germany. It means the German people rose up and supposedly attacked the Jewish people. And the Jewish people have been using this attacks against them to their advantage for 1,000 years. It was Gershom ben Judah who claims that the Germans attacked him in his city there in the Mainz, Germany. So anyway, the last little point I want to make here is in October of 1959, George Lincoln Rockwell founded the American Nazi Party. Okay. So the war this is the birth of neo-Nazism. So the war ended in 1945, but then in 1959, the American Nazi Party started, let's bring back Nazism. And in 1970, Frank Collin formed the National Socialist Party of America. Now, there was, by that time, by 1970, there was already kind of competing factions within this American neo-Nazi movement. And one of the factions was called the National Socialist Party of America. And that was being run by a Jewish guy by the name of Frank Collin. And his name was Cohen, but he tried to hide that by changing his name to Collin, Frank Collin. So in the 1977, Frank Collin launched a court case, which is in Skokie, Illinois. So this was when the word Holocaust was put on the map. In the year 1977, there was this Jewish guy who had gathered a team of neo-Nazis, and they were planning a rally, a march in the city of Skokie, Illinois. And the city, it was a predominantly Jewish city. And so that's why this neo-Nazi had planned the rally for that city. And so what happened was there was a huge court case that lasted months and months and months. And finally, at the end of the court case, he was not allowed. Him and all of his neo-Nazi were not allowed to march in Skokie, Illinois, but they were allowed to march in Chicago. So in 1977, Frank Collin, this Jewish guy who was dressed up as a neo-Nazi, started promoting Nazism. And because Frank Collin was promoting Nazism, he also started educating Americans about the so-called Holocaust. Before 1977, not many Americans knew much about the Holocaust. It wasn't being shoved down people's throat like it is today. So the reason they started shoving Holocaust down people's throat is because of the appearance of the neo-Nazis. So they had to put their puppets in power. And Frank Collin was the Jewish guy who was dressed up as a neo-Nazi, who was, like, you can say, the first Holocaust denier. So once you have a Holocaust denier, then you can start promoting the Holocaust to everybody else. Oh, look what these evil neo-Nazis are doing by denying our Holocaust. And the guy who was denying it was the Jewish guy himself. And not only that, in the year 1979, Frank Collin was sent to 3 years in prison for molesting children. It's all just a puppet show. And it's the same puppets who funded Hitler to power, which are the same puppets who are funding the neo-Nazis today. It's a controlled opposition movement. So that's the end of my
Beautiful.
thing here on this so-called Holocaust. You got any questions?
No, I do not have any questions.